morning, Drumbo Church family. I'm reading the devotion for Wednesday, the 19th of March. And today's Bible passage is Luke chapter 13, and we're reading from verse 10 through to 17. One Sabbath day, as Jesus was teaching in the synagogue, he saw a woman who had been crippled by an evil spirit. She had been bent double for 18 years and was unable to stand up straight. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Dear woman, you are healed of your sickness." Then he touched her, and instantly she could stand straight. How she praised God. But the leader in charge of the synagogue was indignant that Jesus had healed her on the Sabbath day. "There are 6 days of the week for working," he said to the crowd. "Come on those days to be healed, not on the Sabbath." But the Lord replied, "You hypocrites, each of you works on the Sabbath day. Don't you untie your ox or your donkey from its stall on the Sabbath and lead it out for water? This dear woman, a daughter of Abraham, has been held in bondage by Satan for 18 years. Isn't it right that she be released even on the Sabbath?" This shamed his enemies, but all the people rejoiced at the wonderful things he did. Our devotion from Sinclair Ferguson today is called The Bent Over Woman. You could always tell where Jesus would be when the weekly Sabbath came around, in the local synagogue. Sometimes Christians seem to take a rather gloomy view of the idea of a day of rest and find it either oppressive or irrelevant. Paradoxically, some polls suggest that Sunday, the Sabbath as it would be now for most Christians, has become the most stressful day of the week for many people. Jesus would not have been one of them. His soul was soaked in Psalm 92, a song for the Sabbath, and in Isaiah chapter 58 and verses 13 to 14, call the Sabbath a delight. He knew it was one of God's creation gifts, as written in Genesis chapter 2 verses 1 to 3, which was restored in the Exodus 20 verses 8 to 11, and Deuteronomy chapter 5 verses 12 to 15. But whereas the Pharisees were neurotic about what could and could not be done on the Sabbath, and created their own rules and regulations about it, Jesus simply enjoyed it as a gift from God that helped to regulate all the days of the week. The Sabbath was made for man, Mark chapter 7 verses 2 and 27. It was a great time and motion principle for the whole week. Work hard for God for 6 days and enjoy resting in God's presence on the 7th. Very clever, really. To enjoy the Sabbath day required discipline and working habits on the other 6 days. It was a whole week patterned for blessing. It helped you work and it gave you rest. It was meant to be a delight, but the Pharisees had turned it into a straitjacket. Since his father had blessed the Sabbath, as we read in Genesis 2 and verse 3, it was the most natural thing in the world for Jesus to bless and heal people on it. After all, his healing miracles were little foretastes of the glorious restoration that would take place on the final Sabbath day of resurrection. So, it is no surprise that he noticed a needy woman in the congregation that day. He couldn't really miss her while he was teaching during the service because she was incapable of standing up straight. For some 18 years, she had been severely disabled by a back deformity. Jesus called her over, laid his hands on her, and freed her from the disability. Imagine the scene as Jesus places his hands on the woman, probably on her bent back, don't you think? You can almost see his hands straightening it out. After all these years of being diminished in stature, she began to stand tall. If you've ever known someone with a severe back deformity, you will find this a staggeringly moving moment. Sinclair Ferguson writes, "I think of a dear elderly lady in our congregation who had to turn and raise her head in order to speak to me, and who regularly received painful spinal injections to give her some relief. Would you not shed tears of joy to see Jesus place his hands on someone like that?" Not apparently if you were the president of this synagogue. He had invited Jesus to teach, but Jesus, not content with merely preaching God's word, had worked. The president stood up in front of the congregation and gave them a lecture on the spiritual dangers of the healing of suffering people on the Sabbath. "If you want Jesus to heal you, come back on a weekday," he said. Jesus was full of compassion for this woman, but he was fierce in his response to the ruler and his friends. He said they were hypocrites in verse 15. They condemned this woman for being healed on the Sabbath, but they had no hesitation about untying their donkey and leading it to get a drink of water before the synagogue service began. Sin is always inconsistent, and Pharisees exist all over the place. There is the religious variety, of course, as here, and there is the secular variety. Our media can be lamenting the death of a pregnant whale and her unborn calf due to plastic pollution on one day, while passionately advocating abortion rights the next. Sinners can never be consistent, but saints are called to be precisely that. And one area in which we should seek to be consistent is in calling the Sabbath a delight, as written in Isaiah chapter 55 and verse 13. To be like Jesus, to use it well, that has a knock-on effect. It helps you to use the rest of the week well too. There were at least 2 people in the service that day who called the Sabbath a delight. Jesus was one, and the crippled woman became the other. Sinclair Ferguson invites us to reflect today. Would it make any difference to how you live your week for the glory of the Lord if you called the Sabbath a delight? Bye-bye.